Welcome to the Three Pillars Law primer on survivorship options. Proper estate planning requires you to think about how to distribute your property to the descendants of your beneficiaries if one or more of your beneficiaries have deceased. There are methods that determine how to divide that property among the beneficiaries' descendants. We call these survivorship options, and there are several to consider. Most people want simple fairness when considering how to distribute property to their beneficiaries' descendants, but fairness in this regard depends upon what you consider to be fair. As well, there might be other scenarios that have occurred that may change the way this is done. For example, perhaps you've already given a grandchild a substantial gift while you're alive, and so perhaps you want to account for that gift when considering your other descendants. So, estate planners use specific terms to describe some of these mechanisms. The three we will discuss are per Stirpes, by representation, and per capita at each generation. These are just some fancy terms that are a kind of shorthand to describe how you want your property to be divided amongst your beneficiaries' descendants, but they do need explanation so that you can be clear on which method you desire. In the per Stirpes model, shares in your estate are determined by the number of children that the settlor, the person who creates the trust, leaves behind. In other words, each child constitutes one stirp. The by representation model distributes the number of shares as determined by the number of descendants at the first level, or at the first generation, where a grantor leaves then living descendants. Under a per capita at each generation model, we have the number of shares to be distributed determined by the number of descendants at each level. In other words, we look at every generation where we have a potential taker in interest, and we divide the shares ratably at that level. Now, that was a bit of a mouthful. So let's take a look at how these methods actually work under each model. Under the per Stirpes model, assume the settlor of the trust, who we will call Tom, has 3 children, Peter, Paul, and Mary. Each child would take an equal third in the event Tom dies, and each child is living at the time of Tom's death. In this demonstration, we indicate someone's death by using the color red, and if they are alive, they will be green. Now, let's say that Peter predeceases Tom. In other words, he dies before Tom does. In that case, under the per Stirpes model, Paul's 3 children would each take a ninth, which is 1/3 of their father Peter's third, and Paul and Mary would each receive their full third. Here, each child constitutes one stirp. If Peter and Paul both predecease Tom, again, Peter's children take 1/3 of his third, Paul's single child takes Paul's full third, and Mary receives her full third. If all 3 children predecease Tom, again, each child constitutes one stirp, so Peter's children divide his third in equal thirds. Paul's child receives Paul's full third, and Mary's 2 children receive her third in equal halves. So here we see Peter's 3 children take their third of their father's third, or 1/9. Paul's child receives her full third from her father Paul, and Mary's 2 children each take half of their mother's third, or 1/6. Now let's take a look at the method called by representation. Again, if Peter, Paul, and Mary are all living, each receives their full third. There's nothing new there. If Peter predeceases Tom, then Peter's 3 children divide Peter's third in equal thirds, or 1/9 each, and Paul and Mary each receive their full 1/3. If Peter and Paul both predecease, Peter's 3 children take their 1/3 each of their father's 1/3, which still makes 1/9 each. Paul's child still receives her dad's third, and Mary, the only child of Tom still living, receives her third. But now, if all 3 of Tom's children predecease Tom, we see a difference with the by representation model. In the event all 3 of Tom's children predecease Tom, we look to the first generation where we find then living descendants. So, the generation comprised of all Tom's children have predeceased Tom. So we look at the next generation by representation, and we now have 6 equal shares by representation. So under a by representation model, we end up treating all of the grandchildren the same if all of the settlers' children have predeceased. Now, per capita at each generation takes this step one further. Again, Peter, Paul, and Mary are all living, so they all take their third. If Peter predeceases Tom, the settler, Peter's children take a third of Peter's third, making it 1/9 for each of Peter's children, and Paul and Mary each get their third. But now, if Paul also predeceases, so now both Peter and Paul have predeceased Tom, we have Mary getting her 1/3, and we have 2/3 being divided among the living grandchildren, or in other words, the next generation level. So we have 1/6 going to each of the 3 children of Peter and to Paul's one child, or 1/4 of the 2/3, so 1/6 each. Mary, still alive, takes her 1/3. If all 3 children predecease under this model, we look only at the generation where the grandchildren are, and they will each take 1/6 of the remaining distribution. We hope that this has helped you understand the distribution models available to you. If you have any questions, please contact us to discuss these options further.